Dexter Gordon was a bebop prodigy in the 1940s, was sidelined by drugs in the 50s. He moved to Europe in the 60s, came home in triumph in the 70s, and starred in the film Round Midnight in 1986. Meet Long Tall Dex, as the 6'5" jazz saxophonist was often called, was one of the primary innovators of bebop jazz and a perennial favorite of audiences and music critics. He had a natural sense of cool that made him the picture of the classic jazz cat. Dexter Gordon, born February 27, 1923, was an American jazz tenor, saxophonist, composer, bandleader, and actor. He was among the most influential early bebop musicians, which included other greats such as Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, and Bud Powell. His studio and performance career spanned more than 40 years. His father, one of the first African-American doctors in Los Angeles and an avid fan of jazz music, exposed him to jazz from the time he was an infant. When Gordon was about 7 years old, his family attended a concert by pianist Duke Ellington's orchestra. Years later, he described it to Rolling Stone as beautiful. It was magic. I never got over that. Gordon's family encouraged his enthusiasm. He began studying clarinet at the age of 13 and moved on to alto sax 2 years later. He spent his allowance on recordings by tenor sax master Lester Young. Lester Young played very melodic, Gordon commented to a downbeat interviewer. Everything he played you could sing. He was always telling a story, and Charlie Parker did the same thing. That kind of musical philosophy is what I try to do. After studying Young's style and sound, Gordon fell in love with the robust voice of the tenor sax and adopted the instrument as his own when he was 17. The same year, he hit the road as a member of Lionel Hampton's band. He stayed with Hampton for roughly 2 years before jumping to pianist Fletcher Henderson's outfit very briefly, and then moving on to trumpeter Louis Armstrong's ensemble. While he admired Armstrong's sound, he was annoyed at the band's conservative approach to music. Everything was just blah, he said during an interview. Within 6 months, he had become a member of singer Billy Eckstine's group. There, he was more comfortable, playing alongside other legends-to-be, like Charlie Parker and trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie. The difference was like night and day, said Gordon, because there was nothing but happenings, excitement, and enthusiasm in Eckstine's band. On their journey toward what would become known as bebop, Eckstine's band broke musical ground daily in their casual jam sessions. By 1945, many of them felt they had outgrown the confines of the big band sound and had gravitated to New York City's Harlem, where a new style of jazz was taking shape. Gordon was among them. The fast pace, adventurous chords, complex harmonies, and extended improvisations the young players were producing constituted a true musical revolution, one that met with considerable resistance, even hostility, from older jazz musicians. Gordon and his peers had no idea how drastically they were changing the course of jazz. But, he told Rolling Stone, we knew we were doing something different, something hip, something fly, something wild. Throughout the late 1940s and early 50s, Gordon toured and recorded with most of the notable musicians of the day and cut classic records such as Dexter's Deck, Dexter Rides Again, and Long Tall Dexter. But the musical revolution wasn't the only thing happening. Heroin was a major element of the bebop subculture, and Gordon, like many of his friends, became addicted. Eckstine fired Gordon in 1945 for a drug habit that made him increasingly unreliable. Gordon's drug habit eventually put a hold on his career, with 2 lengthy incarcerations during the 1950s. By the time his first sentence ended, Gordon's main idol, Charlie Parker, was dead from heroin addiction. Jazz musicians were frequent targets of police in the 1950s, when LA led the nation in narcotics arrests. Dexter Gordon's own jail time included months in Folsom Prison, and in an interview, he says that incarceration saved his life by keeping him away from heroin. Gordon recorded 3 exceptional albums in 1955 before going back to prison for another 5 years. Ultimately, a decade of addiction began to interfere with his music. I had to shoot up before I played, and it got in the way of my jobs, he told People magazine. I didn't get fired, but I didn't get hired either. People didn't know when or if I'd show up. Before we dive deeper into Dexter Gordon's story, would you please take a moment to support this channel by subscribing? Give it a like and leave a comment too. I would really appreciate it. Now back to the story. Gordon's personal and musical rebirth began in 1960 when he was paroled from prison and performed as both a musician and actor in the Los Angeles production of a play called The Connection, in which, ironically, he portrayed a drug addict. Appearing in the play boosted Gordon's confidence, and although he hadn't recorded since 1955, Cannonball Adderley encouraged him to make an LP with a sextet. Finally out of prison and free of his heroin addiction, the shadows of his past still, nonetheless, haunted him. The New York City Police Department refused to issue him a cabaret card necessary to perform in nightclubs. Without it, little work was available. Released as The Resurgence of Dexter Gordon in 1960, the album showed that Gordon's saxophone playing, though a tad rusty, was still top-notch, and became the launchpad for his career's great third act. He initially commuted from Los Angeles to New York to record, but took up residence in New York when he regained the cabaret card that allowed him to perform where alcohol was served. Gordon signed with Blue Note Records in 1961. The Blue Note Association produced a steady flow of albums for several years, some of which gained iconic status. His New York renaissance was marked by his albums Doin' All Right, Dexter Calling, and Go. When Gordon was offered a few weeks' work in Europe in 1962, he gladly left the country. The few weeks stretched into 14 years. In Europe, there was no racial discrimination or anything like that, Gordon told Downbeat magazine. And the fact that you're an artist in Europe means something. They treat you with a lot of respect. Over the next 14 years in Europe, living mainly in Paris and Copenhagen, Gordon played regularly with fellow expatriates or visiting players. After playing a concert in Copenhagen, he settled in Denmark, where he learned its language, became familiar with its customs, and like many Danes, rode a bicycle to travel about town. While in Copenhagen, Gordon's trio appeared on screen in a theatrically released hardcore pornographic film, Pornography, for which they composed and performed the score. Gordon also visited the US occasionally for other recording dates. Getting Around, as well as Our Men in Paris, was recorded for Blue Note during a visit in May 1965. Gordon may well have remained abroad indefinitely, if not for the efforts of a jazz promoter who would eventually become his third wife. In 1976, she persuaded him to tour the United States. He appeared for a gig at the Village Vanguard in New York that was dubbed as his homecoming. The standing room only crowds greeted him with thunderous applause. Their reaction to the master saxophonist's New York stopover was nothing short of phenomenal. He observed, "There was so much love and elation. Sometimes it was a little eerie at the Vanguard. After the last set, they'd turn on the lights and nobody would move." The response convinced Gordon that the time had come to return to his native country. Gordon returned to the United States for good in 1976. The saxophonist's triumphant reign of the jazz circuit continued throughout the late 1970s and early 80s. But in 1983, he decided to retire and made what he expected to be his final appearance. Though he was just 60 years old, fast living had exacted a heavy toll on his health. For 3 years, Gordon lived quietly with his wife and stepson, but his career was not yet over. In 1986, French filmmaker Bertrand Tavernier asked the musician to star in Round Midnight, a film he was making about a down-and-out jazz musician living in Paris. The fictional story was based on the lives of jazz luminaries Lester Young, Bud Powell, and Gordon himself. Tavernier said during an interview that when he first met Gordon, he had the impression that he was going to fall down and die on the spot. But despite his fragile health, Gordon turned in a masterful portrayal of his character, Dale Turner. He was even nominated for an Academy Award. In 1987, he and the other musicians from the cast of Round Midnight did a short tour, performing the music they'd created for the film, but a combination of cancer and kidney failure took his life in April of 1990. He was 67. His passing brought down the curtain on a career that had lasted 47 years and had unfurled like an epic play. A promising beginning, leading to a decade in the wilderness, followed by an unlikely resurrection, and then a long exile that eventually culminated in a triumphant hero's return. Listeners could sense all those different experiences embedded in the DNA of his music, and that his effortlessly flowing saxophone improvisations never dwelled too long on sadness and always exuded an uplifting, optimistic warmth. This is Donovan from One Track Jazz. Please subscribe, and if you want to see more videos like this, click on the videos on the screen.